Hey guys, tonight we begin with something surprisingly timeless. Getting absolutely wasted, but we're not talking about your average college night out. We're going much further back in time to the muddy, candlelit streets of medieval Europe, where people drank not just for fun, but because the water might kill them. So before you get too cozy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're tuning in. It's always fascinating to see who's listening from across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some background noise, and let's gently wander back to a time when hangovers were treated with leeches and beer was considered safer than a glass of water. Let's begin tonight not with a king or a knight, but with someone far more consistent in medieval society, the town drunk. He had no sword to polish, no land to tax, no armor to polish. His job, as far as anyone could tell, was simply to be visible, loud, and inconvenient. Every village had one, or several. They were as common as fleas on a dog or saints on a calendar. The town drunk was not necessarily poor, nor always pitted. In fact, depending on the town and the size of its beer supply, he might have been treated with a strange, slightly amused reverence, a sort of living cautionary tale with legs, a face, and a smell that could wake a dead bishop. Children were told, if you keep stealing the honey cakes, you'll end up like old Wulfric, as Wulfric staggered past with one boot, no hat, and a strong scent of barley. Wulfric himself may have taken pride in his role. After all, someone had to test the tavern's newest brew. Someone had to shout out mildly heretical songs during Sunday Mass. Someone had to fall into the duck pond at least once per market day. It was, if nothing else, a job with consistent deliverables. Taverns in medieval times were often multi-purpose structures, not just for drinking, though that was certainly the star attraction. They served as makeshift courtrooms, gossip centers, pig sales venues, and the occasional low-budget hotel. Within this fragrant wooden box, the drunk would perform his rituals. A few coins down, a frothy tankard in hand, perhaps a turnip as a side dish, and then the slow descent into incoherence. It wasn't all ale and antics, though. Public drunkenness was a crime in many parts of medieval Europe, but it was a crime often enforced with flexibility. In England, for instance, local constables might fine you, might dunk you in a punishment chair, or they might simply laugh and send you home if your only offense was singing off-key. The line between criminal and community entertainment was thin, slippery, and usually blurry with mead. And mead, for the uninitiated, was not some mystical elven beverage. It was a sticky, honey-fermented drink that could range from delightfully sweet to, I think I just drank a beehive. Its popularity in early medieval Europe was considerable. Not because it was refined, but because it was often safer than the water. If your local stream doubled as both a bathhouse and a sewage chute, a mug of mead suddenly seemed like a hygienic decision. But the town drunk rarely stopped at mead. He was an equal opportunity imbiber. Ale, beer, cider, perry, wine, if available, wormwood-infused whatever, and in desperate times, something bubbling in the monastery's cellar that may or may not have been intended for floor polish. He was a man of taste, or at least tolerance. Let's not pretend the rest of the town was sober. Oh no. Ale was the daily drink of peasants, nobles, monks, and even children. It was the liquid bread that washed down their actual bread. But most people drank small beer, a very weak, very mild brew with just enough alcohol to kill microbes but not enough to knock you flat. Getting truly wasted was a choice, and that choice came with a social role. There were even names for them. In German towns, he might be called the Zecker, the one who revels. In France, perhaps a soulard, a term only mildly more dignified than perpetually damp with wine. In English, he might be known simply as the alesot, a word that has aged poorly but once rolled off the tongue with a kind of resigned affection. And what did the drunk actually do besides drink? Well, he was often the spark of village tales. If he danced naked on the feast day, the story lived on for years. If he loudly mistook the vicar's wife for a scarecrow and tried to tip his hat to her for keeping the crows away, that became part of local folklore. He was a walking anecdote factory, a living punchline, the medieval jester with no official title or salary. Sometimes, too, the town drunk could become a scapegoat. Did someone steal the baker's hens? Probably Wulfric. Was there mysterious wailing outside the midwife's hut? Wulfric again, of course. That unholy groaning wasn't ghosts. It was just the lingering effect of drinking something called Old Monastery Surprise. Yet Wulfric carried on, staggering his way through history without ever being important. His contributions weren't recorded in any manuscript. No stained glass features his flushed cheeks, but his presence was constant, humming just behind the candlelit curtain of medieval life. And as strange as it may seem, his role may have offered a kind of strange comfort. In a world where life was unpredictable, plagues, famines, taxes, Viking raids, more taxes, Wulfric remained gloriously consistent. He would drink, he would shout, he would fall, and then he would rise again the next market day, like a slightly sour phoenix, to do it all again. And so, the townsfolk would chuckle, adjust their hoods, and sip their small beer, thankful that at least someone had the free time to be utterly, blissfully, functionally drunk. Let's talk about shoes, or rather, the almost complete lack of them. If you imagine a medieval peasant walking through the forest in a cozy pair of leather boots with reinforced soles, think again. Most peasants walked barefoot. Yes, barefoot, on roads that were not paved but packed with manure, mud, broken pottery, and occasionally a rusty nail left over from someone else's miserable accident. Foot injuries were as common as fleas, and those weren't rare either. A stubbed toe could easily turn into an infected wound, which could then, depending on your luck and the phase of the moon, lead to sepsis. All because you went out to feed the chickens. If they did have shoes, they were often made from scraps, sometimes just a bit of cloth wrapped around the foot and tied with twine. Leather shoes, when available, were rarely waterproof, had thin soles, and rotted quickly from constant exposure to dampness. Socks. What a delightful thought. Woolen scraps if you were lucky, and if you weren't, well, you learned how to ignore frostbite. Now let's imagine you're trying to sleep. You think you'd fall into your straw mattress like a medieval Snow White, but the reality was more crawling. The bedding was stuffed with straw, sometimes hay if you were fancy, which might sound rustic until you realize it was also full of lice, mites, and other little friends. Fleas were a constant companion. You didn't go to bed alone. You went to bed with a thriving insect ecosystem that shared your warmth, your blood, and your dreams. If you were especially lucky, you might also be sharing that straw mattress with a couple of siblings or an in-law. Privacy was a modern invention, you see. And yes, people itched constantly. The phrase, "don't let the bedbugs bite," wasn't some silly nursery rhyme. It was a nightly prayer, a hope, a desperate plea whispered before crawling into a sack of suffering and praying not to wake up with plague sores. Because, spoiler, that also happened. Speaking of nights, let's discuss the joy of going to the bathroom in the dark. Indoor plumbing? Oh, absolutely not. You either had a chamber pot by the bed, which was essentially a fancy word for a bowl you defecated in, or you walked outside to the pit latrine, assuming you had one. For many, toilet was synonymous with nearby bush. Imagine doing that at 3 a.m. during winter with no lantern, no boots, and the risk of stepping on a rat or falling into the actual pit. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. And while we're here, let's talk about rats. These weren't cartoon rats who cooked in French restaurants. These were plague-bearing, bold little monsters who weren't afraid of you. They lived in your walls, they scurried across your floor at night, and sometimes they even bit your toes while you slept. That wasn't considered unusual. That was just part of life. Hygiene, if you can even call it that, was mostly theoretical. Bathing was rare, once a week if you were a miracle worker, once a season if you were normal. And even then, the bathwater was often reused by the whole household. First, Dad would go in, then Mom, then the kids in order of age. By the time the toddler got in, it wasn't so much a bath as a broth. Soap was homemade, gritty, and harsh if you had any. People scrubbed themselves with rough cloth, sometimes even sand or ash, to get the dirt off. which is ironic, since the entire environment was one giant dirt-producing machine. You could spend an hour scrubbing yourself raw and walk outside only to be covered in mud, soot, and pig droppings 5 minutes later. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was next to impossible. Let's not forget that water itself wasn't always safe. Wells could be contaminated, rivers carried disease, and rainfall wasn't reliable. Boiling water was a thing, yes, but that required fuel, firewood, and time. Many people just hoped for the best. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne friends made frequent visits to medieval homes. So if you were lucky enough to get clean, you probably drank something that made sure you wouldn't stay that way for long. Now picture yourself falling ill. You might think, no problem, I'll just take some medicine and rest. What medicine? Herbs were popular, but understanding of which herbs helped and which herbs killed you was often vague. Medieval medicine was a mixture of guesswork, superstition, and old scrolls copied incorrectly by monks with fading eyesight. If you had a fever, they might bleed you. If you had a rash, they might apply a paste made of honey, crushed snails, and moldy bread. If you were lucky, the remedy would do nothing. If you were unlucky, it would make things much worse. And you didn't get to rest either. Rest was a luxury. Crops needed tending, animals needed feeding, and the lord of the manor still expected your taxes, even if you were coughing up your last breath. Dying was not an excuse. You could be fined for missing your obligations. Your family could be penalized, so you got up, sick or not, and worked until you physically couldn't. Marriage and family life didn't offer much comfort. Women were married off young, sometimes as early as 12. Men were expected to be the providers, which meant endless labor. Children were put to work as soon as they could walk. Childhood was more of a waiting room for responsibility and hardship than a time of joy. Toys were rare, schooling rarer. Most kids could expect to help in the fields, tend livestock, or assist in domestic work by age 5. Love? That was nice if you had it, but not expected. Marriages were about alliances, property, survival. If you loved your spouse, congratulations. If not, tough luck. You still had to live together, work together, and probably bury your children together. Mortality rates were cruel, infant death, death in childbirth, and early disease meant nearly everyone you loved might die before 30. Churches in the Middle Ages were built to last. That meant thick stone walls, high vaulted ceilings, and absolutely no insulation. Nothing says cozy worship like freezing your toes off while listening to a sermon about eternal fire. These towering sanctuaries of faith were magnificent. Sure, majestic stained glass, echoing arches, altars that gleamed in candlelight. But don't let the divine decor fool you. Attending a medieval church in winter felt less like a spiritual gathering and more like surviving a stone refrigerator. The average peasant didn't have the luxury of skipping mass just because of a little frostbite. Religion was deeply interwoven with daily life, and missing services wasn't just frowned upon. It could get you into some serious ecclesiastical trouble. So, wrapped in whatever bits of wool they owned, they trudged through slush and snow to sit on cold wooden pews for hours. Yes, hours, because priests, being naturally warm in the glow of holiness, and possibly more layers, often delivered long, meandering sermons, the kind that tested not only your faith, but your ability to remain conscious with numb fingers and a dripping nose. No one dared cough too loud or shiver dramatically. It might be mistaken for demonic possession or, worse, impiety. To add insult to injury, there were no fires in the church. Open flames were considered too risky near wooden rafters and hay-stuffed thatch. So instead, the heat of human bodies had to suffice, which meant if you arrived late, you'd be sitting near the door, the medieval equivalent of Siberia. Children, naturally smaller and colder, were bundled like root vegetables in sacks of whatever was available. Patched cloaks, woven shawls, or hand-me-down tunics that still smelled faintly of goat. They were expected to sit still and holy, which worked for about 12 minutes before the pinching, squirming, and whispering began. Parents responded with the classic medieval hush technique. A swift flick to the ear and a glare that promised eternal damnation, or no supper. And yet, despite all this, the church was oddly comforting in its shared discomfort. Everyone cold, everyone bored, everyone wondering how much longer the priest would speak in Latin about things no one understood. It was a communal suffering, the kind that bonded villagers together more tightly than any festival or harvest. Because let's be honest, there's nothing like mutual hypothermia to bring a community closer. Some churches, in more generous parishes, allowed the use of foot stoves. These were small, personal braziers filled with hot coals that parishioners could tuck under their pews. Of course, only the wealthy had them. Peasants made do by stamping their feet now and then or clutching their hands under armpits in a quiet act of survival. Sometimes, if the priest was particularly progressive, or simply tired of the sound of chattering teeth, he'd permit the congregation to huddle near the altar. Not because it was holier there, but because it was ever so slightly warmer thanks to the thick candlelight and closed stone chancel. Still, the fear of sin kept many from moving. You wouldn't want to be caught trying to heat your feet near the host and risk the wrath of divine judgment. Better to sit and freeze than warm and burn in hell, they reasoned. A strange calculus of comfort and eternal consequence. Outside the church, the graveyard stood in permanent slumber. Covered in snow, marked by lopsided wooden crosses or crumbling stones, it served as a bleak reminder. At least you were alive, no matter how cold. The dead didn't feel their toes anymore. You still could. Barely. After service, the villagers would shuffle out, steam rising from their bodies like tired ghosts. The sun, if it was kind, might shine faintly through winter clouds. Most of the time, though, the wind picked up just as you opened the door, reminding you that even God's house couldn't shield you forever. Back at home, there might be a fire waiting, a soup pot barely bubbling, maybe a cup of weak ale. But first, you'd warm your hands by sticking them under your sleeping sibling's blanket, because that was faster than waiting for kindling to catch. So why go through all this? Because the church wasn't just about religion. It was a rhythm, a structure, a moment in the week when everyone gathered, not just to pray, but to exist together. In the stillness, in the frost, in the knowledge that no matter how hard life was, everyone else was enduring the same absurd chill. There was a kind of peace in it, a kind of absurd, noble suffering that turned the pews into places of quiet courage. No fire, no cushions, no comfort, and yet, they came. Week after week, season after season, generations learning to sit still through the sermon and let the silence sink in. And perhaps, in some strange way, the cold helped, kept you awake, kept you human. It reminded you that you were alive in a world that didn't care if you were cold, but a community that did. A priest who noticed if you coughed too hard, a neighbor who passed you a scarf, a friend who whispered a joke and made you smile despite the cold. So yes, medieval churches were freezing, but they were also warm in ways that modern thermostats will never understand. And now, let us wander into the soft folds of history, where the comforting embrace of a nightgown was replaced by something far more practical. Picture it, the Black Death sweeping through Europe like a spectral fog, and doctors donning what might be the least relaxing sleepwear in human history. A long waxed gown, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, topped off with a charming leather mask shaped like a bird's beak. Ideal bedtime attire if you're hoping to lull your enemies to sleep with fear. These plague doctors looked less like healers and more like nightmarish visitors from a very confused masquerade ball. Their beaked masks weren't just a fashion statement. They were filled with dried herbs, crushed rose petals, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges, all designed to ward off the miasma, the invisible poisonous air they believed caused illness. Because if there's one thing you want next to your nostrils before a restful slumber, it's a pouch of garlic, lavender, and the desperate scent of medieval denial. The gown itself was wax-coated linen or leather, designed to be impermeable. Nothing says restful like a full-body oven suit in the middle of summer. Imagine trying to get comfortable in bed wearing that. No tossing, no turning. Just sweating in your own portable greenhouse, hoping that the plague didn't find its way in through the stitching. Of course, the irony is that none of this worked. Not really. The beak masks and coats did little to prevent the spread of fleas or the bacteria they carried. But it gave people a sense of control, which is all humans have ever really wanted in the face of chaos. That, and perhaps the dream of eventually slipping into a less feverish sleep. Meanwhile, if you weren't a doctor, your odds were worse. Peasants, laborers, monks, all wore their usual garments to bed. Whatever they had on was likely what they would die in. During outbreaks, bodies piled faster than they could be buried. Death came swiftly, and sleep, real, gentle sleep, became a luxury no one could afford. Some towns enacted nighttime curfews, not to keep people safe, but to limit panic. So, if you were tucked into your straw mattress listening to the coughs of your neighbors grow weaker, you had to do it quietly. Panic after dawn. Mourn when the bells rang. But during the night, lie still. Let the darkness wash over you. Ironically, plague brought about a surge in superstition-fueled bedtime rituals. People wore amulets around their necks, slept with holy relics under their pillows, or lit pungent fires in their homes, burning juniper or rosemary to cleanse the air. Essentially, aromatherapy with a strong side of existential dread. Children were told stories not to comfort them, but to frighten them into compliance. If they didn't pray, didn't obey, the plague would come for them in the night. Bedtime tales became warnings. Don't touch strangers. Don't walk by the river. Don't trust the wind. Sleep, child, or sleep forever. And let us not forget those fortunate enough to survive. Those immune or merely lucky. They too struggled with sleep because survival didn't mean safety. It meant guilt, grief, and the burden of rebuilding. They lay awake wondering why they were spared. The night offered no answers, only silence. We romanticize plague doctors now. Their strange masks turned into Halloween props and edgy tattoos. But for those who truly saw them, approaching through smoke and fear, they weren't icons. They were omens. And seeing one at your bedside didn't mean healing. It meant goodbye. Still, the human spirit is stubborn. Even as the world collapsed around them, people tried to carry on their routines. Boil some herbs, whisper a prayer, tuck the children in, hope that tonight would be quiet. And in this quiet, we find a strange peace, the soft rustle of straw beds, the echo of distant bells, the perfume of crushed rosemary and the creak of old wood floors. History may be cruel, but it sleeps beside us, wrapped in waxed cloth and hopeful lies. So breathe slowly now. Imagine the flicker of candlelight against plastered walls, the faint, herbal scent of thyme and rue, and know that even in the darkest chapters of our past, people still tried to rest. They still searched for calm, for something, anything gentle, even if it wore a beak. And so we continue, sliding gently further into the past, where darkness fell hard and candles were hoarded like gold. We've already wandered through shared beds and midnight prayers, chamber pots and creeping vermin. But there is more, always more, when it comes to the strange and slumbering habits of a world without Wi-Fi. Let us now lie back beneath thatched roofs and timber beams, and consider the curious medieval tradition of sleep interruption. Yes, if you've ever found yourself waking up at 3 a.m. and staring at the ceiling in existential dread, congratulations. You might be more historically accurate than you'd care to be, because in the medieval world, sleeping all the way through the night wasn't really a thing. Instead, there was first sleep and second sleep, a glorious gap in the middle of the night where people would get up. That's right, just casually rise at midnight, light a rushlight or two, and potter about. Maybe say a few prayers, maybe go check on the animals, maybe, just maybe, engage in a little intimacy. This interlude between two sleeps was well documented in diaries, letters, and medical texts of the time. People often used it for quiet reflection, light chores, or philosophical conversation. Imagine that. You get up in the middle of the night, and instead of doom scrolling or microwaving cold leftovers, You kneel beside your straw bed and chant psalms. Or you wander over to your neighbor's cottage for a late-night chat. Because of course, they're awake too. In some households, this interlude was even the preferred time for conception. Doctors believed it was when the body was most rested and the humors most harmonious. What a romantic thought. Midnight passion, sandwiched neatly between dreams and dawn, with the scent of damp wool and smoked herring in the air. Eventually, you drift back into your second sleep, which was considered lighter, dreamier, and closer to the divine. In fact, many religious texts suggested that second sleep was when one might receive visions or divine inspiration. Modern science might call it REM sleep. The medieval mind called it a gift from God. Of course, not everyone was enjoying this leisurely nocturnal break. For many, that in-between time was filled with dread. The night was still the realm of demons, witches, and shapeshifters, after all. Some people believed that if you so much as left your bed between first and second sleep, your soul might wander out the door and forget to return. A chilling idea, which is why a great many folks preferred to huddle quietly under scratchy blankets and murmur prayers until it was safe to sleep again. Still others used the break productively, spinning, mending clothes, preparing herbs. In large manor homes, servants might use the time to stoke fires or prepare for the day ahead. In monasteries, monks followed strict schedules, waking for midnight prayers known as matins, reciting scriptures in candlelit chapels while the world slept and the wolves howled outside. This fractured sleep cycle didn't disappear overnight. In fact, it lingered well into the 17th and even 18th centuries. Only with the rise of artificial lighting, urbanization, and industrial schedules did people begin striving for that elusive, uninterrupted 8-hour block. And now, ironically, we spend billions of dollars trying to reclaim the kind of deep, natural sleep that our ancestors seemed to interrupt on purpose. Meanwhile, in castles and cottages across the land, the noble art of sleep continued to evolve or devolve, depending on how you look at it. Pillows, for instance, were not always the comforting headrests we know today. In early medieval Europe, pillows were a sign of wealth and status. Most common folk just used a rolled-up cloak or sack of grain. Even nobles, when they had pillows, didn't necessarily use them for the head. Sometimes they were used to prop up arms or knees. The modern idea of head-on-pillow sleep was still developing. Some medieval sleepers even believed it was unhealthy to sleep flat. It encouraged bad humors to collect in the head. So instead, they'd prop themselves up in a semi-sitting position, snoring away like slumped philosophers, half expecting divine wisdom to descend at any moment. And beds themselves? The centerpiece of nocturnal life. Rich households had enormous wooden bed frames, carved and curtained like altars. They weren't just for sleeping, they were for showing off. Guests would admire them, and children were sometimes born in them while witnesses stood by, nodding solemnly. A bed was a stage. Sleep was a performance. And dreams? They were divine theater. For the poor, it was often less poetic. A straw pallet on the floor, perhaps shared with a sibling, spouse, or goose. If it rained, the roof might leak. If it was cold, the straw might freeze. And if it was noisy, well, there was no such thing as soundproofing. The neighbors argued. The pigs grunted. The wind screeched through the gaps in the wall. And still people slept. Because sleep was not a luxury. It was a necessity. A brief nightly surrender in a world filled with hard labor, illness, and uncertainty. And what of the sense of sleep? Forget lavender sprays and eucalyptus-scented pillows. The air was a pungent brew of sweat, smoke, mold, and sometimes worse. Cleanliness was rare. Nightshirts were optional. Chamber pots were under the bed or worse, beside it. If you were lucky, your nose grew numb to it all. If not, you simply endured. But despite the discomforts, the interruptions, the shared bodies and straw-filled sacks, medieval people did sleep. They dreamed strange dreams. They murmured to saints. They fretted over omens and prayed for peaceful rest. And in the stillness of that second sleep, They sometimes believed they glimpsed eternity. So tonight, as you lie in your climate-controlled room, on your memory foam mattress with your blue light filters and white noise apps, know this: your ancestors managed to sleep through wolves, curses, lice, screaming babies, drunk neighbors, and the occasional ghost. And somehow, that's oddly comforting. Now breathe a little deeper, and let the candlelight of history flicker faintly in the distance. We still have more to explore. They say necessity is the mother of invention. But in the medieval world, necessity was also the mother of deep disappointment. Take the blanket, for instance. If you imagine peasants curling up under a big cozy woolen coverlet next to a flickering hearth, please gently lower your expectations. Because wool was expensive. So expensive that it was more likely to be worn than slept under. The average peasant might have had a single coarse blanket for the entire household. And by blanket, we mean something roughly the consistency of a potato sack that had been chewed on by a goat. In most peasant homes, people didn't each have their own blanket. No, entire families often slept huddled together in one bed to share warmth, under a communal covering that was probably scratchy, drafty, and slightly damp from the perpetual humidity of thatched roofs. No one was tucking themselves in. They were simply lying beneath the same itchy rug of disappointment. And if that wasn't sufficient, you added more bodies. That's right. Children, cousins, neighbors, possibly the pig. In winter, everyone became a makeshift heat source. Your bedmate might be your brother, your grandmother, and a chicken all simultaneously. This wasn't considered odd. It was called survival. Peasants also knew how to manipulate their meager furnishings. If they had a straw mattress or something like it, they might stuff it with old rags, moss, even feathers if they were lucky enough to own a chicken who gave up more than just eggs. The mattress would be turned and restuffed periodically to reduce mildew and mice. Notice we said reduce, not eliminate. Some particularly inventive households layered cloaks, old sacks, and threadbare garments over themselves. You didn't discard old clothing, it graduated into blanket duty. A tunic full of holes was just a breathably ventilated quilt by another name. There were regional variations too. In colder northern regions, peasants might use animal skins, though the comfort of a fur covering was often reserved for higher status folks. That meant if you wanted a fur blanket, your best bet was to trap something yourself. Good luck skinning a badger in the snow using a rusty kitchen knife. In extreme cold, peasants turned to tricks that seem almost charmingly desperate today. They'd place a pot of heated stones under the bed, if they even had a bed, or carry a warmed brick, wrapped in cloth, into their straw pallet to serve as a temporary heat pack. And by temporary, we mean about 20 minutes of lukewarm hope before returning to the cold grip of reality. Even fires weren't the comfort you might imagine. Open hearths in peasant homes were inefficient at best. Most of the heat escaped through the roof or out the crude chimney, if there was one at all. Many homes had just a hole in the ceiling and a constant draft. Fires were allowed to smolder rather than burn brightly to conserve fuel. The result? More smoke than warmth. Your lungs would stay toasty, at least, and should you be lucky enough to fall asleep, you had to hope no one rolled over and stole the one functional covering, which was usually a crusty sheepskin that smelled faintly of livestock and despair. Children were often sent to bed with their siblings for maximum body heat, though being the youngest meant you were placed squarely in the middle, flanked by two feverishly warm older brothers who kicked in their sleep and smelled faintly of turnips. Winter clothing was also not taken off at night. Why would it be? You needed every layer you owned just to avoid freezing. Peasants frequently slept fully dressed, including hats and mittens if they had them. It was not uncommon to wear the same tunic day and night for weeks, only peeling it off in spring when it could be safely washed without turning into a frozen plank. Now and then, the church would kindly remind people that enduring hardship in winter was part of their spiritual journey. Suffering built character. And nothing built more character than waking up in the middle of the night because a rat stole your sock, or worse, your cheese. If there was one constant throughout medieval winter nights, it was the sound. The crackle of the dying fire, the wheeze of a dozen cold lungs, the distant howl of wind, and occasionally, the squeal of something scurrying across the floorboards. Nothing quite says bedtime like the gentle pitter-patter of vermin searching for crumbs near your toes. So the next time you're wrapped in a heated blanket, sipping chamomile tea in a memory foam bed, think of your peasant ancestors, huddled together, wrapped in a damp cloak, sharing their mattress with two siblings, a dog, and a dream of slightly fewer fleas. And remember, warmth was not a guarantee. It was a group project. Of course, no conversation about medieval cleanliness or its theatrical absence would be complete without stepping into the steamy, chaotic world of the public bathhouse. If you imagine dim, candlelit tranquility and polite conversation, you may need to lower your expectations. Think more of a sudsy tavern than a serene spa retreat. Bathhouses in the Middle Ages were equal parts hygiene, social hub, and borderline brothel, depending on the hour. In places like 13th century Paris or 15th century Nuremberg, you'd find bustling wooden bathhouses lining the riverbanks. These weren't just for scrubbing behind your ears. No. These were gathering grounds where men and women bathed together, argued politics, exchanged gossip, sang drinking songs, and, frequently, contracted something regrettable. The idea of privacy, entirely foreign. Bathing was communal. People stripped down, climbed into large shared tubs, and splashed about in water that was clean only for the first handful of bathers. If you were the unlucky sixth or seventh patron, you essentially marinated in the day's worth of town secrets, garlic-sweated armpits, and medieval foot rot. Hot water was a luxury that depended entirely on firewood, and someone willing to haul it, burn it, and wait around long enough to warm the bathhouse cauldron. If wood was scarce, so was your chance of a warm soak. And in winter, it wasn't uncommon for bathers to enjoy the surreal contrast of steaming water while their wet hair literally froze in place. Still, for all its hazards, the bathhouse was the medieval version of social media. You weren't clean until you'd rinsed yourself in boiling local rumors. Housewives gossiped about their neighbors. Merchants whispered about taxes. Apprentices flirted with washerwomen, and everyone collectively ignored the fact that bathing in the same tub as 10 strangers probably wasn't the pinnacle of sanitation. Religious authorities oscillated wildly between tolerating and condemning these establishments. On the one hand, cleanliness was next to godliness. On the other hand, some bathhouses doubled as covert meeting spots for lusty liaisons, and the church didn't love that. In many cities, bathhouses were required to close at certain hours or separate men and women by day of the week, but enforcement was inconsistent at best, and medieval flirtation was nothing if not persistent. Interestingly, in Muslim regions like Al-Andalus, bathing was far more advanced and ritualized. The hammam was structured, elegant, and deeply spiritual, offering hot, warm, and cold rooms in succession, often with an attendant to help scrub your back and your sins away. In contrast, European bathhouses were like a fraternity party with mildew. By the 16th century, as syphilis and plague became household names, public bathing started to fall out of favor. Doctors and theologians began whispering dark theories about the dangers of opening your pores with heat. It was said that bathwater could carry miasmas, or bad air, directly into the soul. Water, once a symbol of purification, became suspect. And with that, thousands traded warm baths for cool indifference and a cloud of rose-scented denial. But in the high days of the public bath, it was a place to cleanse your body, your spirit, and occasionally your reputation. Or ruin it. Depends on who saw you there. So, you've made it through the fleas, the fasting, the foul-smelling streets, and the fundamentally flawed feudal system. Congratulations. But don't get comfortable yet, because now it's time for your favorite part of any normal day in medieval times, trying not to be accused of witchcraft, or heresy, or simply being suspicious while owning too many cats. Yes, the Middle Ages were a golden age of finger-pointing. If you were a little too curious about herbs, weather patterns, or why the local priest's wine never seemed to run out, you were basically halfway to the stake. Knowing things was not a popular trait unless you were a monk or a man with a beard long enough to prove divine wisdom. But let's say you weren't dabbling in herbs or asking dangerous questions. You were just going about your quiet little life, minding your own business, maybe brewing some ale and occasionally whispering to your goat. Unfortunately, your goat died, and someone's child had a fever, and suddenly, you've got 6 villagers at your door with pitchforks and torches, convinced you've been consorting with the devil. Or at least the kind of person who owns strange dried roots and occasionally howls at the moon. Because, toothaches. Trials were an adventure in logic. If you float, you're guilty. If you sink and drown, you're innocent but dead, so it's a win-win for justice. They called it trial by ordeal, and yes, that was the actual term. You could be forced to carry a red-hot iron a few paces or dunk your hand into boiling water. If your burns healed properly after a few days, you were innocent. And if not, well, maybe you should have considered less suspicious hand hygiene. Of course, the local clergy had some say in the matter, but their education in law often consisted of vague Latin phrases and a talent for making everything sound like a sin. That's if you were even granted a trial. Many accusations were settled via rumor, divine visions, or some guy named Oswin who swore you gave him a funny look 3 harvests ago. But maybe you weren't a woman, and you didn't live near a goat, and you weren't weirdly good at healing warts. Maybe you were a man, strong of back and suspiciously silent. Good for you. Now you'd be accused of stealing, or being a foreigner, or of not paying your tithes, which was a holy way of saying the church wanted more of your bread and barley. Punishment for such sins came with flair. Stocks in the town square were a favorite. Imagine sitting for hours with your head and hands trapped in wooden boards while children threw moldy cheese at you. Or if your crime was more severe, you might lose an ear, a hand, or, for particularly enterprising thieves, your entire livelihood, like your millstones or your only horse. Sometimes public shaming wasn't enough. There were also scold's bridles for talkative women, iron masks that kept their mouths clamped shut, because apparently speaking more than necessary was both a social offense and a punishable one. Meanwhile, a local lord could legally assault his serfs if he believed it improved morale, somehow. And in case you thought you'd find safety in silence, think again. Saying nothing could also be suspicious. If the village was going through a drought, a poor harvest, or an unfortunately timed eclipse, someone had to be blamed. And it was often the quiet ones, or the ones who still had food when others didn't. Or, most damning of all, the ones who knew how to read. Still feeling brave? Let's pivot to nighttime again, shall we? You've survived a long day of agricultural labor, social suspicion, and the faint possibility of being flayed for having a dream that vaguely resembled a prophecy. Now it's time to rest, which means curling up on your straw mattress again. Yes, the one with fleas, damp spots, and whatever your pig tracked in. But tonight there's a storm, and medieval houses, if you could even call them that, leaked more than they sheltered. You'd get water trickling down through the thatch, right onto your face, or worse, onto your one and only blanket. Then there were wolves howling in the woods, and the occasional scream from a neighboring cottage where someone had, unfortunately, succumbed to dysentery. Again, you sigh, roll over, and hope the rats aren't chewing through the bread tucked under your bed, or through your toes. In some towns, night watchmen would yell the time and weather every hour to prove they were awake. So sleep was a constant gamble between hypothermia, rodent invasion, and unwanted hourly town crier updates. But don't worry, you might be awakened anyway at dawn by the sound of the church bell, signaling another fast day, or another funeral, or maybe just another day of taxes. Because yes, you could be taxed on your harvest, your livestock, your land, your chimney, your market stall, your grain mill, your soul. Basically, if you owned it, they'd tax it. If you didn't, they'd fine you for pretending you might own something someday. And if you thought being a peasant was bad, try being an apprentice. You'd be locked into a 7-year contract where you worked endlessly under a master craftsman who could beat you, starve you, or take credit for anything you ever made. And you'd be grateful, because one day you might own a shop, unless you died of tuberculosis first. Let's not even begin on childbirth, or plague, or famine, because yes, we're saving the truly depressing bits for later. You've still got one more section to go. So far, you've faced broken teeth, medieval breakfast, suspicious neighbors, livestock romances, and legal systems that involved boiling liquids and thumb screws. You've walked through dung, tripped over corpses, been accused of heresy for knowing your alphabet, and now you're wet, cold, and under constant threat of divine punishment. Mostly because your uncle once saw you talking to a cat. And yet somehow medieval people lived, laughed, and even composed poetry through all of it. Perhaps out of sheer stubbornness. Or possibly because sleep deprivation and fermented cabbage produce incredible hallucinations. But for now, it's almost time for your final journey. Not to the gallows, no, we'll save that for the outro. Just to the last section of this calming little horror story about your hypothetical medieval life. Take a breath, adjust your straw pillow, and try to keep your head down. There's still one more day to survive. By the time we reach the later Middle Ages, something fascinating begins to happen. Sleep wasn't just sleep anymore. It became performance, a display, a holy trial, a divine opportunity. And no, that's not exaggerated. This was the age when sleeping badly could actually be interpreted as a sign from God. Imagine you're a peasant, walking barefoot across miles of muddy roads to reach a distant shrine. You've got a bed sore from sleeping on hay, a dozen flea bites, and your only companion is a borrowed donkey with a bad attitude. Why are you doing this? Because you snored under the moon and had a dream where Saint Edmund wagged his finger at you. That's all it took. Medieval Europe was thick with tales of dream visions and sleep miracles. You didn't just rest your head. You entered a realm where saints appeared in technicolor robes to tell you secrets or warnings, or in some cases which relics to go dig up behind the church. There's a reason pilgrimages and sleep were so intertwined. Long journeys meant long nights in strange barns and churches, on dirt floors or beside tombs. The idea was that you were closest to the divine when furthest from comfort. So pilgrims often slept in holy spots, by tombs, under altars, near miracle wells, not to rest, but to seek visions. These spiritual sleepovers were called incubations, and they were taken seriously. People reported healing dreams, instructions from the Virgin Mary, or even spontaneous cures. One man with a paralyzed arm claimed he dreamt of Saint Cuthbert stroking his hand, and when he woke up, he could chop wood again. Which, if true, was probably very convenient for the monastery that hosted him. Some folks even paid for the privilege of sleeping near saints, because nothing says good night like curling up beside a centuries-old skeleton in a jewel-encrusted box. And in monasteries, monks were quite literally trained to sleep righteously. Sloth, after all, was one of the 7 deadly sins. So if you yawned too often in prayer, or heaven forbid, nodded off during matins, you might get a stern lecture, or a whack with a candle holder. It was holiness through exhaustion. But outside the abbeys, the holy had competition. Folk healers, village witches, and herbal women also claimed dream cures. They'd tell people to sleep with certain herbs under their pillow, like mugwort or yarrow, or to chant rhymes before bed to summon a healing dream. Was it science? No. Was it effective? Possibly. Was it weird? Absolutely. Of course, not every dream was welcomed. Nightmares were feared, deeply, not as signs of poor digestion, but as assaults by demons or witches. Nightmares weren't just scary, they could kill you. The night hag legend, the belief that an evil spirit sat on your chest and stole your breath, was so common it shows up across Europe in countless forms. The Saxons called it the Mara, the French, Cauchemar. The Germans had tales of Alp demons, and in each case the solution was similar. Sleep with iron under your bed, hang herbs by the door, or say a prayer against incubi. Because nothing ruins a pilgrimage like being strangled by a ghost in your sleep. Even the church got in on the action. There were official prayers for warding off bad dreams. Some pilgrims carried amulets specifically to protect their sleep. And if you were rich, you might even pay to have a monk sleep in your place and dream on your behalf. Outsourcing your visions, very on brand for medieval nobility. And while all this was unfolding, let's not forget the beds. Pilgrims often shared floors with animals, strangers, and the occasional corpse. Bed sharing among pilgrims was practical, of course, warmth and safety, but it also made for awkward sleep. You might lay down next to a coughing farmer, a flatulent noblewoman, and a barking dog, all while hoping for a miracle from Saint Benedict. Sleep in the medieval world wasn't just something you did, it was something that happened to you. A test, a gift, a punishment, a story to be told. And no matter how uncomfortable or bizarre, it was always meaningful. Because when you believe that the divine speaks to you in dreams, you begin to see every twitch, every breath, every shadow as a message. Sleep becomes a stage, and you're just an actor hoping for a miracle before dawn. And with that, we roll deeper into the hay-stuffed pillows of history. The weird gets weirder, the holy gets holier, and the medieval mind keeps dreaming under leaky roofs and starry skies.